over the past 40 years, we've neglected science to the benefit of capitalism, I think in many cases. I think like good science hasn't won, or like good innovation hasn't won over the past 40 years. It's like profitable innovation. And so I think as we transition our world economy to being more sustainable and being less profit oriented, I think this new market for science will play a huge role, because I think these new organizational forms that BiotechDAOs pose and that asset classes like the ip-NFT pose actually stand a chance to make our current system fundamentally more efficient.
Hey guys, Alex here, and welcome to a brand new episode of the DeSci Podcast. We've got two very special guests today. Paul Kohlhaas is the co-founder and CEO at Molecule and is a founding steward at ValleyDAO. I'm also happy to be speaking with Vincent Weisser. He's a product lead with a background in design and development and currently serves as Chief of Ecosystem at Molecule, as well as Chief of Ecosystem and as a founding steward at ValleyDAO. These two are both forefront pioneers in DeSci, with invaluable early experience shaping the space and deeper insights into what it might look like in the future. Today we spoke about the origins of Molecule, the state of scientific research, the biggest problems DeSci helps solve, and the launch of Molecule's newest project, bio.xyz, the first biotech DAO accelerator. Hope you enjoy. All right, guys, let's do it. Thank you for making the time, first of all. It's great to get a chance to sit down and chat.
Great to be on today, Alex.
Amazing. Well, listen, it's definitely an exciting time with bio.xyz being launched and out in the public and everything. Super excited to dig in and learn about all the work I'm sure you've been doing behind the scenes. But first, let's take a few steps back here, because there's a great story to tell on the road to getting there. Paul, why don't we start with you? You've got a pretty different background, and it sounds like falling into crypto and drug development was more happenstance later on. So before we hear the story of how Molecule came into being, I'd love to hear a bit on how you found yourself getting interested in the field in the first place.
Absolutely. I was a member of like a lot of online biohacking communities as a teenager. So these were communities that were exploring alternative diabetes treatments, for example. So insulin patients that didn't have access to insulin. This actually gave birth to the open insulin movement in the United States. So you essentially had people in online forums collaborating to get access to therapeutics that they didn't have access to. In other cases, these were HIV communities developing their own HIV gene therapies, essentially just experimenting on themselves, but in some cases actually with really interesting outcomes and results. In other cases also, I think this form of open source drug development that we started really seeing in the early 2000s with the advent of online forums that essentially enabled patient groups and just researchers to come together and essentially explore what's out there. I found that really fascinating. In other cases, for example, you have psychedelics communities comprised of patients, again, researchers that are looking at hundreds of essentially back then legal psychedelics and were exploring their effects. And I found this really fascinating. I started asking myself, why are these people online doing this in the first place? Isn't this what pharma's role should be? And as I started looking more into the role of the pharmaceutical industry and actually serving some of these patient groups, I realized that they were really underserved and that there was actually a lot of innovation out there that could help them today, but that pharma companies weren't making accessible. The same time, this was I was about 17, 18, and this was the time the opiate crisis in the United States was becoming more prevalent. And I really started wondering how the pharma system at a macro scale really serves patients on an organizational scale. So you have a lot of you have a lot of diseases or patient groups that could be treated with pretty accessible diseases today, pretty accessible medication today. And on the other case, you have a pharmaceutical system that is more interested in pushing revenue drivers onto the market rather than curing patients. So there's a famous article written by Goldman Sachs in 2018, just titled "Is Curing Patients a Sustainable Business Model?" And this was focused on the development of a new hepatitis C drug that essentially cured most of its patient population. And there was a huge outcry back then, because essentially what Goldman did was write this article stating that this pharma company should have never developed this hepatitis C drug because it essentially almost like it killed its user base, its client base, by developing a drug that actually cured patients, rather than treating them over the life cycle of a disease. There's many examples like this in the medical system. And so I kind of, when I was 18, 19, I read a lot into this and got quite upset with the status quo, that it's just really unfair if you're born with a certain disease and you don't have access to affordable healthcare around it. So I went on and I studied economics. During my time studying economics, I got into biotech stock trading. I found that really interesting, as a biotech company is typically focused on developing one, maybe two lead therapeutics that they're developing in-house. And typically biotech stocks, at least when they're small cap, so they're pretty small companies, they tend to trade at the burn rate of the company, which is essentially just trending downwards at a pretty steady rate. And then positive data emerges around a drug and the stock price shoots up by like 5x, or negative data emerges and the stock price almost goes down by minus 80%. And I found that really fascinating, because it's a fundamental market inefficiency if you think about it, that like there's this big data package being produced and this one siloed company, no one gets to look at it, and then it's released and like, wow, by magic, the company appreciates 5x in value. And often actually within that process, negative data is never shared. So companies today actually don't have an incentive to share any negative data. But I did a connection back then. So this is kind of back to my like open source teenager years spent on Reddit. I made a connection back then that like these, essentially in these forums, you had data emerging in real time. People would say like, hey, let's test the following drug, order some of it in from a Chinese manufacturer, and essentially live report the clinical data that they were gathering. And in the other case, you have this extremely siloed, closed system. And I figured back then that there's something amiss here, and something that could be aligned in the terms of how therapeutics are developed much more openly. Then around the same time, we got into Bitcoin. This was tail end of 2013, just before and after the Mt. Gox crash. And found that another really interesting community, because it had a lot of the cryptocurrency community actually has a lot of similarities, or had a lot of similarities with the open source software development community, as well as with these open source drug development communities that I was a part of. And then went on the long rabbit hole that is crypto. Here we are today. But following that, I worked at Consensus for about 1.5 years, 2017 to mid of 2018. Did a lot of work there around data marketplaces and also digital identity standards. And back then at Consensus, this was Uport, we were trying to figure out how to attach digital identity data to non-fungible tokens, essentially as a way to opening up personal identifiable information on-chain. So imagine if you have an on-chain identity, you typically have an Ethereum-based address. And back then, one primer that we were looking at were attaching NFTs with essentially private data repos attached to them, to identities. For example, you can imagine healthcare records as a use case. And so I had an aha moment back then where I was like, hey, and this was also the time that CryptoKitties started like really taking off quite widely. And I had this aha moment where I asked myself, hey, what if instead of attaching a picture of a cat to an NFT, we actually attached a composition of matter patent? So like a marker structure, the fundamental piece of IP that describes a novel chemical entity or a new drug. And what if we attach that to an NFT to essentially claim IP ownership? And then what if we essentially obfuscate all of the private trial data that is attached to that, and essentially make it tradable and transferable on-chain? And been pursuing that vigorously since 2018. Very humbled that this entire process that we began thinking of almost 3 years ago is actually starting to work. Very excited to be here with you today, together with Vincent and you to usher in a new age for biotech.
Excited to be here with you too. That's quite a path. Vincent, what about you? You're obviously quite deep in this. You helped initiate VitaDAO, and you seem to wear a lot of hats at Molecule, but you have, I think, a background in design and development. What were some of those earlier interests that influenced the path that you've taken to get here?
So I think it started out, I think, super early on, just like being excited by the internet and really the possibility, like as a kind of like young, like as a teenager, to just build on the internet in a permissionless way, like even like with a website, like and no one knows, like if you're like like I think at the age of 14, I just like started creating some websites, and like people took me seriously, and it interviewed interesting people on blogs and stuff, and I was surprised, like but just like how easy it is to like get in touch with interesting people and build stuff in the internet, no matter your like background, age, or credentials, and got really excited to just like basically got drink the startup Kool-Aid like early on, got excited kind of like by just like technology and startups broadly, and building and exploring the space. And then I remember just like asking myself kind of like what would be kind of like to degree the most effective and impactful technologies, also for a positive impact on humanity in general, and kind of explore different areas. Also, like jump deep into effective altruism and explore kind of like biotech, AI, like just like kind of like the whole buffet of interesting technologies that could have a positive impact on humanity, and really got then in 2016 kind of like excited by this idea like of Ethereum broadly, but then specifically of the DAO, like as one of the first examples of like an interesting use case where like everyone could come together to like fund decentralized technologies built on top of Ethereum, and kind of like put all my Ethereum into the DAO, like alongside a ton of other people. I think like 20% of all Ether went there in the first day, and then of course got hacked, so it didn't work out actually, which made me a bit more pessimistic, like in the sense, oh, like it doesn't seem to work. But then actually I got also one of my best friends into it, and we started exploring the space, and then exploring building a decentralized Ethereum exchange. So that was I think 2017 or 18 with and then got also excited in parallel by going deeper into like exploring biotech and longevity, and went to conferences, etc., and just met the first few people in the space, and tried to figure out like what could be the most impactful thing for me to do. So kind of like got deeper and deeper also in exploring drug discovery and the basics of kind of ML in the context of drug discovery, and then actually had the idea and for like, is there something interesting at the intersection? Because my theory was, okay, like there like at some of these intersections, there are interesting things to be built that are non-obvious, but worth exploring. And then like I remember like trying to register like longevitydao.com, like without knowing anyone who was working on this at the intersection. But then actually met Paul and Tyler in 2021, actually, I think earlier that year, and then they shared with me also that like what they've thought about and built with Molecule, and then the idea for VitaDAO. So I joined and helped on all kinds of aspects on VitaDAO. And yeah, I think the really exciting thing for me then also with VitaDAO was just like the possibility of like having again like a broad global online community shared under the same goal and mission, and trying out different initiatives, and being very collaborative in nature to just like try to have an impact on this broader mission of advancing longevity research. Yeah, and so that's kind of like how it started. So I'm now leading the ecosystem efforts at Molecule, and helping also in bio.xyz basically support and mentor other DAOs in different aspects, how they can venture into this.
Amazing, guys. Moving now like into the state of scientific research and some of the reasons Molecule exists in the first place. I think starting by talking about the state of some of those bigger problems would do us some good. So more specifically, and maybe Vincent, you could speak to this a bit, but how do you break down some of these larger concepts around things like preclinical trials and the value of death for why DeSci makes sense in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the one side, what's relevant to understand is the current like state of funding of biomedical research. And of course, like the main funding body are the big state funding bodies, for example, the NIH, and also equivalent funding bodies in Europe and other places. And fundamentally, they're like definitely had some impact, obviously, on a lot of things, but they're very monolithic, and they have like a specific approach, and they dominate kind of like, for example, biomedical funding with like over 90%, I think, in the space coming from those state bodies. And I think fundamentally, I always believe in this, just like alternative models and trying out alternatives. But and I think going into the why of DeSci, I think the power is really that you fundamentally make it much easier for more people to participate in sciences. I think, like, to a degree, the sciences are extremely like making it hard for people to participate, but also kind of extremely elitist in the sense that, like, people required to have a PhD, required, even if they want to fund, to be, like, for example, in one of these state funding bodies. And I think fundamentally the goal really of DeSci is to make it much easier for people to participate in the sciences, into the funding of sciences, into getting funded to do science. And I think ultimately there are, like, of course, multiple ways and primitives to do so, but I think that's the, like, underlying belief. And I think then, like, specifically, of course, on some of these problems you mentioned, like the value of death and early stage funding of research, I think actually one problem is going back to the big state funding bodies like the NIH, that sometimes, like, the funding that they give is actually not really following up towards translating the research. So fundamentally, most professors or most people at universities are not experts at translating research. They are experts at doing research, but they don't necessarily know how to translate it into actually therapeutics. Like, of course, like biotechs, for example, are very specialized in this. Same for big pharma. And I think sometimes the problem is actually that basically between the academics doing amazing groundwork and actually laying the foundations for later stage research, and then the biotechs and pharmas, that they're like not well integrated and versed together. So I think that what we try to do is basically making it easier and guiding kind of like the academics and researchers in labs, how they can also design experiments in ways that they maximize kind of the possibilities to actually have translational results at the end of it. So I think the power is, for example, in a very concrete example of VitaDAO, is a lot of the applications that come in actually in that state might be funded by an NIH or by other funding bodies. But in our case, because there are also people in our ecosystem that built biotechs before and help translate research, they actually give very critical feedback on how they could redesign the experiments to actually have a higher chance of yielding translational research. So in most cases, actually, the research gets fundamentally redesigned, like their experiments, and then actually has like a much higher potential, for example, to yield translational results. But then I think it goes two steps further in the sense that, of course, there's also this incentive mismatch. It's like if you just get a grant to do research, like ultimately most researchers have the incentive to get tenure, to get a professor track, and get grant funding. They don't fundamentally have the incentive to like lead and translate research into therapeutics. So ultimately, of course, giving also the researchers ownership in that research and really collaborating and bringing them together with the people that can help succeed in translating that research, I think is kind of like the recipe for success there. And I think, of course, there are also other alternative funding models that I think are promising. I think it's ultimately on a macro, I think just that like it's always worth going against like the monolithic old guard that is like very static and not seemingly that effective at checking out like translational research and exploring like all kinds of different experiments on how we could make a dent on translational research.
To keep on the topic of bottlenecks here, there's also this concept, you spoke a little bit about, efficient funding models, but on the other side, there's this concept of journals and other intermediaries sort of siloing or paywalling scientific research. I think the interesting thing here is that you could argue that, science is by definition a classic public good. So paywalls and silos for that data can actually be a pretty big deal oftentimes. How do you think about this problem, and where do you see the biggest opportunity for change here?
Yeah, I think actually the interesting one there is that even, for example, like in a commercializable space of biotechs, it's extremely siloed and like very hard to basically get insights and access to kind of like research. And I think, for example, with VitaDAO, what I think is actually one of the biggest powers is that like a lot of things happen in the open. So, for example, if someone gives like a research proposal, everyone kind of like sees that proposal and sees kind of like the critical questions and reviews. And I think that's actually like fundamentally the power is that like it happens in the open. People can learn in the open, and instead of like behind closed doors. And I think of course the same goes for publishing, is in the sense that right now I think there's already like this revolution happening. I think there was like an executive order by the president, I'm not sure, on making like all kind of like state funded research by nature needs to be now open accessible, I think from next year. So I think they're already like understanding the need for making it a public good, because of course fundamentally if like research is funded by tax dollars, then it needs to be also open accessible, I think, to the broader world. I think going one step further, which I think is like in our case really interesting, is that of course in the current ecosystem, like there's like a ton of biotechs building things in parallel, and of course they're relying on, like they're oftentimes reinventing the wheel on their structures, on their infrastructure, and then of course like have their own proprietary insights, but potentially building on infrastructure that they could, for example, potentially share. So I think actually in that sense, the huge power is building out these Lego blocks also in the execution of science, like for example LabDAO is doing, to actually make it much easier for people to get started on executing and doing science. And instead of like needing gigantic kind of like upfront investments into all of these aspects and infrastructure to do science, like getting funded for science, but also executing science.
Amazing. So Paul, onto you here. You know, we've spoken about a lot of these problems that exist in scientific research as they are sort of currently, as well as these legacy funding models that underpin them. And I think that all makes really good sense in theory, but in practice, why don't we talk a little bit about how a BioDAO actually works, right? So twofold here. Like, firstly, what does the process of operations actually look like internally? And second of all, how does Molecule fit into this problem in the first place?
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. Maybe I'll answer your second question first. How does Molecule fit into this? So essentially at Molecule, about 2.5 years ago, we started full on this journey of trying to enable decentralized drug development. Essentially thinking that, hey, there's in academia in general, as Vincent pointed out earlier, there's this phenomenon called the valley of death, meaning that just so much research actually doesn't make it out of universities, out of laboratories, really out of this early stage translational stage. And a big reason for that is a lack in funding and a lack in funding organizations. And another big reason for it is, so there's a lack of actually organizations and entities that are willing to fund that stage of research. You're typically only looking at grant funding from government institutions like the NIH or other public funding bodies, where you typically have very, very long cycles to get funding. It's very political. Some of the researchers that we speak to say they spend up to 80% of their time essentially fundraising for grants instead of actually doing the research. And on the other side, you have the typical VC landscape, essentially where scientists need to create companies. And so within that, we began asking ourselves, often all that you need for an asset to really, let's say, for a research project to progress in the preclinical stages, all you need is funding for a killer experiment. And so at Molecule, we began out thinking, if we can bring liquidity much earlier into the development pipeline, then that could unlock a huge amount of innovation and essentially make it much easier for early stage researchers or researchers in these kind of preclinical stages to get funded. And so to do that, we began thinking through some of the similarities that we saw happen to artists in the NFT market. And fundamentally, because NFTs and IP are a great fit together. Because NFTs essentially enable you to encapsulate like a singular asset, which you typically have with drug development. You can build out portfolios of IP as well through therapy NFTs, but that's a different question. So we actually began building out, let's say, a marketplace for early stage IP. And as we began building that out, we also realized, hey, actually, it's quite difficult to build a community around a single research project. Just because the risks are quite high and the level of sophistication of the community needs to be super high. So So typically, you have a relatively maybe small patient population or small group of experts around the world that would know enough about a given kind of a given specialized research project to give a broader opinion on it. And so we had these two things. Initially, we thought, hey, should we essentially almost do crowdfunding for individual research projects? And we realized that's quite hard because it requires a lot of sophistication on the funder side. And so eventually we began looking at how biotech holding companies essentially operate. So biotech holding company is typically specializes in a specific area and begins identifying research in that area, research assets at universities, at laboratories, maybe at other biotech companies, and essentially buying that IP to develop it in-house. And because another really important question that we asked ourselves is initially, the way that ip-nfts work, I can essentially show up as like a sponsor or a buyer of an ip-nft. So me, you, or Vincent could kind of go onto our platform and we could say, cool, we're going to be the ones, we could form a small team and we could say, cool, we're going to sponsor this research at the University of Texas or at the University of Singapore. And now we would pool our funds together and we would kind of send them the money through our system, we would purchase the ip-nft, and now we own the ip-nft. And now we're like, cool, well, the research has been funded, the data creation process kicks off. But we're actually like, if we're not really sophisticated biotech investors, we wouldn't actually know what to do with the IP, how to further develop it, or actually even how to refine it and make it valuable so that it can be commercialized later on. And so as we got deeper and deeper into bringing IP on chain, we realized that governance is an extremely important aspect of IP more broadly. Because even with early stage IP, you kind of need to decide, you need to decide a lot of things on an ongoing basis. And that is, initially you need to decide what the scope of the experiments are with the researcher. Many researchers actually, when they first come to ValleyDAO, there's a whole set of refinement that needs to be done to their work to essentially ensure that the research is almost on the right track with what other peers in that particular space believe, and that the research actually leads to a commercializable IP. So commercialization is often not something that researchers or PIs have front and center when they're doing science. Their primary motivation is to do valuable science, not necessarily to really bring new therapeutics to market. And so this is where these DAOs get really interesting. So typically for example, when you receive funding from a grant issuing body, they would also not think about the commercialization. And this is actually the reason why so many assets get stuck in this preclinical phase or in this valley of death, because most of the funders, if they're not VCs, they're just not interested in actually bringing something to market. Ultimately, it's for the vibes, for the science. And so, to come back to your first question, so what is a BioDAO? A BioDAO, I think we're riding the space as it's being made. It's really, I think, building in production or testing in prod, as folks in crypto would say. But so the fundamental goal of a BiotechDAO is to essentially mimic successful execution patterns in biotech and essentially build a functioning and a self-sustaining DAO that is able to perform the same functions as a high-performance biotech company, but in a fully decentralized way. And so these BioDAOs, for me, are not really, they're definitely not, they're not investment communities so much as they are like decentralized laboratories and like patient groups. So this is something that has come up quite a bit, is like, are these like essentially investment communities or investment vehicles? And I don't really think so, because an investor often would behave very differently than essentially these BioDAO communities do. So to make it very simple, essentially a BioDAO is a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization that is focused on conducting biotech research. This could be, and actually we're seeing a broad range of fields already pop up from essentially re-engineering foods, our food supply, to synthetic biology, biomanufacturing, which are already a little bit outside of the realm of typical, let's say, typical therapeutics development or typical biotech. But so to come back, fundamentally what a BiotechDAO does is it builds a community and a public open community of scientists, researchers, and patients that are dedicating themselves to a very specific therapeutic area or a specific research area. You could also call these research organizations more broadly. And what they now do is they gather, let's say, the best science in their field, and they try to bring the IP that is generated through that science into the DAO. And they do this through essentially building an online community that is much more open than what their peers are used to. And essentially almost creating a funnel where this DAO that now lives in Web3, it begins to suck in IP. These DAOs themselves can sustain themselves through combinations of governance tokens. Essentially, they operate on-chain. They can raise a treasury that is then continuously deployed into funding that research. And ultimately, the goal is for the research to become valuable enough that the DAO can self-sustain itself through licensing activities, through developing the IP in-house. For example, nothing stops the DAO from creating its own startups to commercialize the IP. And ultimately, for this, though, to become like a functioning ecosystem. So essentially, the one way to conceive the value of these DAOs is through their IP portfolios. So now, through the ip-NFT framework, they essentially build a portfolio of IP on-chain. VitaDAO, for example, I think already has 5 full on-chain ip-NFT assets, some of which are already being discussed to, for example, turn into startups or to have follow-on financings. And ultimately, this treasury of IP grows and is governed together by all of the DAO members. They don't have direct rights to the IP. They don't have rights to profits from that IP. They only have rights to govern the IP and to govern the organization as a whole. But so we can imagine if the DAO attracts valuable IP, one way to view the token is as a proxy to all of the IP that the DAO owns. And ultimately, if the IP becomes valuable, the DAO can keep growing itself through that value.
All right, guys, let's get into the new stuff now. You guys publicized the launch of bio.xyz recently, which is really exciting news. But to set the stage for ourselves here, what's the elevator pitch? What is bio.xyz and how does it relate to what's happening at Molecule?
I can also go into it. I think the very short story is to a degree making this implicit learnings that like brought also VitaDAO community and we learned over the last year in VitaDAO to help these emerging sets of biotech DAOs on like very hands-on on different aspects to succeed in funding like of these other areas, like Paul mentioned. And I think ultimately, kind of like building a successful DAO, I think is hard, and building in biotech is hard. And ultimately at the intersection, it's super hard in a sense that like there are not many cases of experience to rely on. Like ultimately, VitaDAO was the first biotech DAO, so we made a lot of learnings and still are making a lot of learnings in VitaDAO. But the goal is really to bring those learnings into other new projects and to really kind of like support and grow this broader ecosystem of decentralized biotech within this umbrella of decentralized science, of funding much more research on chain, but then also bringing stakeholders into the set of biotech DAOs and the biotech DAOs helping each other. So the short story is really supporting and enabling biotech DAOs in their journey, and of course, especially from their conception and early stages to becoming like building valuable deal flow pipeline, funding their first project, and kind of like helping on all of those aspects. And of course, underlying that is really with Molecule, we're kind of like as a company building the protocol and the infrastructure, which we want to make kind of like public goods, like in a sense with, for example, the ip-nft protocol. And then really with, I think bio.xyz, the goal is to progressively decentralize it also into like a DAO of DAOs that basically almost becomes like a meta governance layer for BioDAOs, where you could come in as a governance, for example, expert and help to improve the governance of many of these BioDAOs. But also where the goal really is that, for example, these BioDAOs have governance in the set of BioDAOs, to also have incentive to collaborate even beyond their therapeutic areas on kind of like their insights and knowledge and bring their communities together. So that's the short story. Of course, it's also an experiment in the sense where I think we just started this experiment really like a month ago, and just want to see also like kind of like this set of first DAOs in our cohort. So we basically, which we can go into more depth later, have PsyDAO funding psychedelic research, AthenaDAO funding kind of like women's health research, then HairDAO funding kind of like research into hair loss, and then we have ValleyDAO funding synthetic biology. And this first set of BioDAOs, we really want to see like how much we can help them succeed, and then really also learn and kind of like improve the program on an ongoing basis to provide as much valuable as possible to kind of like the broader decentralized biotech space.
Yeah, I mean, as was mentioned there, you guys have an initial cohort you announced with the program's launch. I think it'd really be interesting to highlight each of them and talk a bit about what they're working on. So before we get into the structure of the program itself, to take them one at a time here, why don't we talk about PsyDAO first? It was made public a little earlier on, but it sounds like there's some really interesting work going on around psychedelics there.
Okay, yeah, so like I think PsyDAO's kind of like inception was also that kind of like both like people in the broader ecosystem, as well as like from our team, got really excited also about like exploring novel funding structures in the context of psychedelic research, because it's of course like a very novel kind of like therapeutic area that also still has like unique challenges. So basically, I think the inception was kind of like almost a year ago now, and kind of like started with like a broader workshop of people coming together during ETH Lisbon in 21, and actually like a quite active community developing of people almost coming together at the Schelling point of psychedelics and crypto, and really exploring kind of like which research to fund at that intersection. So the focus is really on exploring also open funding models for like open psychedelic research, and kind of like the right way to commercialize and advance that research, which I think is more challenging than for other therapeutic areas.
Yeah, maybe I can add a few things. So I think what's really interesting about psychedelic research is that it's at a similar intersection of interest as longevity. It's almost like if longevity is like the expansion or like the permanence of the body, then psychedelics, I think, is like the expansion of the permanence of the mind. And similarly as the longevity research space, it's like the longevity research space was for many, I think for decades, like belittled and almost like ridiculed in traditional sciences. So you have this kind of underdog mentality. Like people like Aubrey de Grey in the longevity space have been like, we're pushing the field forward for decades almost. I think in a similar sense of like, maybe some of you remember Andreas Antonopoulos and like his early, just like his tirade on around Bitcoin and against kind of our current financial system. And with psychedelics, you really had a similar, I think you have a similar underdog mentality where psychedelics have been criminalized in many countries for decades, since the 70s, despite extremely promising research, and is now, again, I think really strongly emerging from the fringes, with extremely promising data emerging. And so one thing that we realized early on at Molecule is, I think picking your niche is extremely valuable as a startup. Just general startup advice. And I think it's really important to build these DAOs with a strong sense of like a Venn diagram of where different user groups and interests actually overlap. And so a lot of people that are into crypto happen to be into longevity, which is actually one of the reasons why I think BioDAO became a big success, is because of this like Venn diagram. I think if you picked, for example, unfortunately, if you chose like a rare disease or a specific type of cancer maybe as a focus area for a BiotechDAO, or at least if you had a year ago, I think it would be much difficult or much harder to still build a community around that, because many people that are in those that suffer from these diseases are just not as Web3 native, or they're not as used to digital technology like Discord servers, the whole jam that kind of makes up the Web3 stack. And so with psychedelics, this is a similar case where I think you have a really strong overlap of people that are interested in psychedelics, also be interested in crypto, and you have a similarly almost repressed research community that is kind of dying for new solutions. And then I think lastly, actually, the ethos of psychedelics and decentralization maps quite nicely together in the sense of in the sense of systemic thinking. I think I think psychedelics move things away from like centralization of power and much more into like a decentralized, sustainable ethos. And so what we're doing with PsyDAO is a very similar thing. It's building an online community of researchers, of patients, of investors that are essentially interested to demonopolize psychedelic research with a DAO that now democratically owns, kind of can own and fund novel psychedelic IP that is emerging. I think we're still at the very beginning of a, I think, much broader, I think, rediscovery of what psychedelic compounds can do for the human body and for the human mind. I'll hand it over to you, Vincent.
Cool. I think next we have AthenaDAO, which seems to be centered around women's reproductive health. Why don't we cover that for a minute or two here?
Yeah, I think the interesting, of course, meta theme there is that it's like an area that is kind of like historically underfunded, but also like I think to a degree also has like novel challenges in their commercialization and translation. But I think ultimately the maybe interesting background story is kind of like that, like a lot of those efforts kind of like also have like from a community standpoint overlap with BioDAO. There was actually a bigger community within BioDAO, kind of like shepherding and leading research projects going into the direction of like female reproductive rejuvenation and health in general, and kind of like exploring projects in that area. And so it really, I think, kind of like from that got kickstarted as a broader community. And then really, I think now they're really exploring just like also mapping out like which areas of research are interesting to fund, and really also understanding the kind of like pathways of commercialization. So I think one of the first projects that they looked at was, I think, called MenoAge by a company called GlycanAge, which I think is building like biomarker like testing for kind of like menopause aging. Like I'm not a deep expert in it yet. Like I'm also following and reading up on their efforts, but I think this is like one example, which of course is like a bit different from like a kind of like a therapeutic, which might have like clinical trials and take a decade, in the sense that it actually is also like a consumer product that people want to access and of course could also access sooner. So I think where it also becomes really interesting is almost this property of BioDAOs also being Schelling points at these intersections, like kind of like of, for example, people that care about women's health and crypto users, which is also like an interesting and relevant cohort of people to explore kind of like new consumer health applications. So yeah, so I think that like that's one of the first projects that I saw that they were looking at, and that I think they're like now I'm looking at still to drive forward, potentially also with BioDAO, which I think is also exciting, like seeing these collaborations between DAOs. Yeah.
Nice. I mean, as a part of the first cohort, we also have ValleyDAO. What's the rundown here? What's the rundown of the project and what the larger mission is?
So ValleyDAO is a DAO focused on synthetic biology and biomanufacturing. Essentially, they're looking at a whole range of projects in the synthetic biology field. I think actually SynBio is such an important topic for essentially learning how we can live on this planet in a more sustainable way. So this goes into how we produce certain building materials, how essentially we produce our food today, how we deal with waste. And there's so much optimization that I think we can do on an engineering level in terms of how we actually engage with the biology of our planet. So their mission is also deeply anchored in, I think, climate change goals. I think there are certain goals, for example, for global food production that we can only meet through novel synthetic biology processes. Like it's a simple exercise of like, if we lose this much arable land in the world, which we will due to climate change, then unless we develop different food production methods, people will go hungry at a certain date if climate change continues to accelerate in the way that it has. And so I'm a huge fan of their mission. Albert, Daniel, and Hamza Please check out their Discord. They recently did a rebrand that we helped them do through bio.xyz. Maybe some of the, I've always been, maybe I can talk about a project that I'm personally really excited about, but I don't know whether they're actually currently pursuing that. They're working with a host of companies already, as well as universities. One of them is the University College London. Essentially, they're very active at the moment in building a researcher community. They've already attracted, I think, some of the leading researchers in the synbio field. And are now working, I think, towards the end of the year already towards minting a first ip-nft, which we're really excited about. IP in the synbio space can work a little bit differently than in the traditional biotech field, where you work more with composition of matter patterns. Typically, in the synbio world, you work with around methods of production, which is also really interesting, actually, for our team to understand a different IP landscape a little bit better. Which is really valuable, like for us on the molecule side, to continuously build out our IP optimization engine. But maybe I'll talk about that one project. I think this was released maybe a year ago, but this also falls into the realm of synthetic biology. I'm a huge gardener myself. Like, I love plants. Like, you'll see some of them in the background at my house. Like, I have probably 40 in total, but I have the stream of like glow in the dark plants, which is actually not that hard to do. And there's a company already in the US that has glow in the dark. I think it's begonias. But essentially that maybe in 20, 30 years, instead of using electricity to power streetlights, we could have glow in the dark plants in like major cities around the world, which would save a ton of electricity. And I just love this. I have this avatar-like vision where you I think in Avatar, there's a scene where they walk through like the garden or something when they arrive there, and it's all like glow in the dark.
Yep.
So I'll leave it there.
Okay. I think that the last one we have to cover here, and then I'd be interested in covering the structure of the program for a bit as well. We have a pretty interesting project in HairDAO, advancing research and development for hair loss treatments. What's the rundown here so people can understand?
Oh, alopecia. Yeah. So alopecia and hair loss is, I forget the word sometimes. Alopecia and hair loss is, I think, another field of research and another actually very large online community that has been really underserved by traditional pharma and biotech. Hair loss replacement therapies are actually just hair replacement therapy, where it's actually a physical surgery is extremely expensive and still today remains one of the the only viable long-term treatment options. And it's just inaccessible for most people around the globe. If you go online actually and you look around, you look into hair loss communities, you'll find vast, sprawling online communities, mostly of very unhappy middle-aged men, kind of as a demographic, but even younger men. It can start as early as 14, 16. Most cases it happens between 20 and 30 or 40. That suffer from hair loss, and it can be a huge factor in a man's life. I think it can affect women as well, but it's mostly dominant with men. And due to the fact that there are very few available treatments, and essentially only like a physical surgery, there are online communities that have been helping each other for the past 20 years almost. It borders a little bit almost on like the bodybuilding communities. Like there's an overlap there. But if you think essentially online communities that are trying to achieve something, and one thing that we find very interesting with BioDAOs is tapping into areas where those online communities already exist. Like if your therapeutic area has, like, let's say a Reddit with 300,000 or 500,000 people in it, that's probably a good area to build a BiotechDAO in, because now you can tap into a massive online community. The same thing is true for psychedelics, for example. The same thing is absolutely true for the longevity space. So actually, I think in therapeutic areas where you don't have that, it's going to be much more difficult to build a BiotechDAO, which is one of the reasons why we're really bullish on HairDAO. We think it's going to grow a lot, just to the size of this online community. But so essentially what they're working on at the moment is working with the leading researcher on hair loss, on funding some of the research that is coming out of his work in I think they're based in Germany. And they've already very quickly managed to assemble like a large online community, essentially tapping into existing connected patient communities, and bringing them into Web3. And we think that's a really powerful model, essentially engaging an existing, well-connected digital community to onboard into a DAO. Yeah, also both of the founders are called Andrews. We call them the two Andrews. Yeah, absolutely love the team and their mission. And like, I think to a lot of us, like, hair loss can feel not that important, but I think when you suffer from it, it's something, that really affects you.
Amazing. To turn our attention back to bio.xyz itself, what's the structure of the program? Like, how does each cohort actually function? What are some of the resources you provide to DeSci projects that take part in it?
Yeah, I can start with this. So kind of like from a high level, right now the structure is roughly that it runs for, like, the first cohort runs for 4.5 months, so for 18 weeks, and like we help on kind of like all different aspects necessary for building a BiotechDAO, which of course goes from like the tech to the tokenomics to helping on regulatory kind of protections to the ip-nft integrations to research and deal flow, governance, tokenomics, community, as well as like branding, design, and then really also just giving like a grant of like $100,000 and kind of like hands-on support in all of these areas, and then really leading to also helping to share and present the project in the cohort with a broader ecosystem to join and support throughout. And I think, yeah, like that's the high level structure.
So how can people apply, and what advice might you have for people looking to join the program? Like, what makes a project a good fit here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, like, of course, the easiest answer is just you can just apply on bio.xyz on the website. Like, the application process is kind of like in multiple steps, and similar to, like, for example, even Y Combinator. Really, I think what makes a good BioDAO, in my view, is like 2 or 3 things. Like the first one, I think, is really actually having a good grasp of like an interesting therapeutic or broader like area of research, with like also mapped out kind of like research deal flow and kind of like a scientist community, and then also like a broader community. Like, it's always like a good sign, like some efforts apply to us that have like that exist since the 80s and have a community of like 10,000 people and regular deal flow and funders, and, for example, act as a nonprofit in the traditional world, but are really excited by this new structure. And that of course like makes it easier in the sense if they've already built up a huge like community of like researchers and deal flow and like a broader community, that it would be excited to get behind this. I think the other aspect, so I already outlined the 2 aspects. Like, I think it's really community, and then kind of like the research area and kind of like deal flow and research there, which I think makes for a good fit. And then I think, like, sometimes, as Paul mentioned, there are like interesting fits which are almost like, which feel almost more like a niche, but actually have like a huge overlap with crypto, like psychedelics and longevity is a good example. But then of course there are also like traditionally big areas, and I think we're still also figuring out like the broader like where BioDAOs will be the most successful. I think in some areas, for example, that are gigantic, like Alzheimer's or oncology, it's also harder to make a dent in the sense because you already have like 50 billions of funding each year flowing into those areas. And something, of course, like longevity is interesting because it's almost like an alternative take on it that resonates more with crypto, that goes to the root cause of the diseases, and ultimately also can then channel, for example, into oncology or Alzheimer's. But so I think we are like agnostic a bit to kind of like the research areas, but of course also try to understand kind of like the long-term potential of those areas and like if they make a good fit for the broader space. But I think like one core thing is really just like having a viral and kind of like active community involving researchers and scientists, but also really enthusiasts and also people from the crypto world. Yeah. And then, like, what's I think also valuable and what I've seen as a pattern and also as like a good point of call to action for listeners is that like a lot of the people that I think are really successful in building out, for example, ValleyDAO, already gathered experience supporting actively in DAO. So I think actually the easiest way for people to join is to join one of these DAOs. Like ultimately all of them have like onboarding calls and like are fairly easy to join, which I think is, of course, the whole point of this decentralized kind of like trustless, permissionless ecosystem is like joining BioDAO, joining ValleyDAO, AthenaDAO, PsyDAO, HairDAO, and other BioDAOs out there. I think is the easiest way to get a sense of how one can add value and potentially figuring out one's own BioDAO to create at some point together with others.
Great. Guys, to start closing out the conversation today, I'd like to take a couple steps back and look further into the future. You know, so much has happened in only the last couple of years, and I'm curious to hear what each of you see the molecule and bio.xyz and larger DeSci ecosystem looking like on a longer time horizon, say, 5 to 10 years from now.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think maybe like starting with like a successful outcome, I think it would really be on the biotech side and therapeutic side is like successful kind of like phase 3 clinical trials. Like ultimately that's like the goal of every biotech is to actually reach patients. And of course there have been biotechs that like were worth $1 billion and then failed, or like even like famous examples in Alzheimer's. And I think we of course they have like totally failed, even though they were valuable at some point, because they ultimately didn't achieve patient outcomes. So I think actually that's kind of like the end goal and everything, and we try to like maximize the odds and likelihood that I think as many kind of like research projects in the ecosystem reach kind of like the successful outcome. And I think one way which we're thinking about more actively is really mapping out different ways how IP could travel, like from the earliest stages successfully through the valley of death into successful clinical trials. And I think it will be multiple pathways there. And I think, of course, one interesting one, which is like a bit separate from our core initiative, but which we, I think, also want to enable is like even open public goods, like novel mechanisms to fund science, which I think, for example, also PsyDAO is looking into. But I think the other is also like a traditional process of helping create spin-offs and spin out biotechs, basically, out of these BioDAOs and help and support with that from the molecule side. But then I think in a much broader sense, I think it's just getting started. I think like there was, of course, already like a blockchain for science movement, I think since 2015 or 16, but also Paul and others in an ecosystem were already involved. And I think, for example, now with a Gitcoin round that we also helped put together, like the broader DeSci ecosystem is just getting its initial funding, and same for bio.xyz. And I think like the future is bright, and I think in a sense, of course, it's not just about BiotechDAOs, but also about the infrastructure, about like publishing, about all of these different building blocks. And I think there's so many people, for example, trying to build the infrastructure now for DAOs broadly, or for now even BiotechDAOs specifically with, for example, LabDAO, or for new ways to do scientific publishing in the decentralized science era. That I think like we'll see a lot also fail and iterate and improve, but ultimately also a lot succeed, hopefully, in driving these patient outcomes. So I think that's like, yeah, really the end goal.
Sweet. Paul, anything to add to close us out here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, personally, I see a future of hundreds, potentially thousands of these organizations emerge and also become much more specialized over time. Almost like you could have domain DAOs and then domain area specific DAOs, essentially just branching out like Merkle trees as they kind of explore a disease more and more, or a particular research area more and more. And then we have to imagine, like, let's say if we maybe in 5 years from now, we're looking at I think there's going to be, with this first cohort, we're going to have 5 biotech DAOs, at least kind of in our definition. I think the definition, though, is open for people to interpret in whatever way they want. And I think we're already seeing, outside of the bio.xyz cohort, there's already many really amazing organizations that we'd love to connect with to also form a part of the network. So big shout out there. But I think maybe in total, we're looking at having, maybe there's 10 active biotech-focused DAOs today, or 8, like something around there. And so maybe if we can extrapolate this, maybe in 3 years, I mean, if we look at, in general, growth curves around new concepts like this, we could be looking at having a few hundred in a few years. And then you have to imagine that each of these DAOs now essentially begins, in our conception, kind of sucking like a vacuum, sucking IP out of the real world into Web3. And then people are going to start building with ip-nfts, with this IP that DAOs bring in. So like Lego blocks, you have to imagine many DAOs forming in many different therapeutic areas, and all of these DAOs now sucking in IP and treating them like Lego blocks, building little sub-DAOs out of them, integrating them into parts of the whole DeFi stack. You can imagine collateralizing your ip-NFT later on. We're very actively working on fractionalization. And so maybe where I see the world in 3 to 5 years is like actually, I think there's a large potential to quickly move into a much more open and liquid market for science and for intellectual property, which would be huge. If you just imagine what's the total addressable market for science, you're talking about one of the, if not the biggest industry in the world, because it touches tangentially so many other areas in our lives. And I think the other reason why actually creating this market for science at this stage in evolutionary development of humanity is so important, because I think over the past 40 years, we've neglected science to the benefit of capitalism, I think in many cases. I think like good science hasn't won, or like good innovation hasn't won over the past 40 years. It's like profitable innovation. And so I think as we transition our world economy to being more sustainable and being less profit oriented, I think this new market for science will play a huge role. Because I think these new organizational forms that BiotechDAOs pose, and that asset classes like the ip-NFT pose, actually stand a chance to make our current system fundamentally more efficient. I think where one of the biggest innovations that I've seen come out of organizations like ValleyDAO or out of BioDAOs more broadly is that I personally believe that they can have a 10x the efficiency of the current system. If you said, I'm going to build a biotech organization today, I'm going to hire, let's say, 50 of the world's brightest researchers in that specific area, you're looking at a pretty high burn rate. And DAOs, in that sense, can now, I think, incentivize people through decentralized token-based governance, but also through an entirely new mission and culture that comes with these DAOs. It's like a mission of open science. It's a mission that brings us back, I think, to the roots of why we're engaging in science, like why longevity is important to us, for example. And I think this actually driving things away from profits back to like the core mission of curing a disease or curing aging is what really motivates people in these organizations. And so I think we have a fundamental chance here to build a better system. And I envision a world where we have hundreds of these BiotechDAOs, and ideally working on thousands of different ip-NFTs, those ip-NFTs becoming fractional, people maybe trading on real-time data, coming back to what I said in the very beginning, rather than waiting 3 months for data around a life-saving drug to emerge. I could see it emerge in real time, maybe through one of the DAOs. I can be a patient and I can get access to an early stage clinical trial that this DAO is working on. I think actually Web3, I think, is all about thinking in open APIs and like open Lego blocks that we can all build around. And that's also really the way that we're conceptualizing bio.xyz, is like as a fully open community, as an open ecosystem that anyone can come into and build the future with. I'll leave it there.
Excited for what the future holds for Molecule and bio.xyz, the larger ecosystem. I think that's about all the time we have today, guys. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for taking the time and having us.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thanks so much for tuning in. For more information about this podcast and about Molecule, and if you have any questions and want to get into a deeper discussion about today's topics, feel free to visit Molecule's site, Twitter, or Discord. You can find all the important links in the description and show notes below. Also, if you're a researcher seeking funding, if you want to start working in a BiotechDAO or get involved in any way, please visit Molecule's website, molecule.to, for more information. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you again soon.